Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to those who are joining us from WA, South Australia, and Northern Territory. Welcome to the second of our two Rail Safety Week 2025 Masterclass webinars. I'm Sudha, and I'm the GM of Products and Innovation at RISP, and I'll be your host for this webinar. Before we proceed any further, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land where we meet today. And for me in Perth, that's the Whadjuk Noongar people. I would like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with us today. For Rail Safety Week 2025, we have dedicated two masterclass webinars to the event because we recognize the evolving challenges in rail safety and the need to address both emerging issues and ongoing risks. Supporting Rail Safety Week aligns with our mission to harmonize safety practices, facilitate knowledge sharing, and build a safer future for all our rail stakeholders. Our commitment to safety is foundational in everything that we do at RISP. Whether we are developing standards, or sharing best practices, or fostering collaboration within the rail industry, we are driven by the goal of enhancing the safety, efficiency, and resilience of our rail networks. RISP plays an integral role in ensuring that the rail sector remains reliable, efficient, and most importantly, safe. By hosting these webinars, we aim to ensure that RISP members, as well as the broader rail community, have access to the latest safety intelligence and regulatory updates, all while maintaining a commitment to industry collaboration and continuous improvement. Today's webinar will feature the Office of Transport Safety Investigations, OTSI, and explore key findings from the Werris Creek investigation. Rail safety investigations aren't just about finding out what went wrong. They're about making sure it doesn't happen again. Every investigation gives us lessons to strengthen safety systems, sharpen training, and spot risk before they cause harm. By reflecting on these insights, we ensure that the hard lessons of the past are transformed into safer journeys in the future. Without taking any further time, let me introduce your OTSI presenters today. First of all, it's Kerry Russell, Director of Investigations, Rail and Metro at OTSI. Kerry has over 30 years of senior leadership experience in the rail industry in both the public and private sectors. Driven by a strong commitment to safety and continuous improvement, Kerry has led complex business units and rail operations and delivered challenging major projects. Kerry joined OTSI as the Director of Investigations, Rail and Metro in 2022, reporting to the CEO, Chief Investigator. In this role, Kerry has been leading the advancement of investigations methodologies and the expansion of investigation capabilities. Key initiatives include broadening stakeholder engagements, reinforcing OTSI's reputation as a leader in transport safety. Also with us today is Marty Mells, Senior Transport Safety Investigator at OTSI. Marty is a Senior Transport Safety Investigator where he leads independent no-blame investigations into bus, ferry, and rail incidents across New South Wales. With nearly 4 years at OTSI and prior experience at the Australian Transport Safety Bureau, ATSB, Marty brings over 2 decades of expertise in transport safety, including a 17-year career with Queensland Rail as a locomotive driver and driver trainer. His work focuses on uncovering the causes of transport occurrences and recommending safety improvements to enhance public confidence and prevent reoccurrence over Australia's transport networks. Before I hand over to Kerry and Marty, let me remind the participants that there's a Q&A tab. Feel free to add those questions as the presentation goes through. And at the end of it, I'll jump back in and we'll have a discussion with Marty and go through those questions. Over to you, Kerry and Marty.
Thank you, Sudha, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. Today, I'm going to start with an introduction to OTSI, for those of you who don't know us, and then I'm going to hand over to Marty Mellis, investigator in charge of our Werris Creek investigation, to talk about our findings on competency assessment. OTSI was first established in 2005 as an independent New South Wales government agency to investigate bus, ferry and rail incidents in New South Wales. We exist to enhance public passenger safety and rail safety through independent no-blame investigation. Our Chief Investigator is a statutory position and he is independent of the Minister, regulators and other transport agencies in determining what to investigate and how investigations are conducted. OTSI investigation reports are publicly available on our website and are also tabled in the New South Wales Parliament. The aim of a no-blame investigation is to prevent the occurrence of similar incidents through sharing safety lessons and insights such as we are doing today. And our investigations are a little unique in that they do not assign blame or liability on individuals, but rather seek to understand why an incident occurred and how supporting systems may have failed to manage the risk. So where does OTSI fit in? OTSI is the no-blame transport safety investigator for New South Wales, undertaking no-blame investigations into transport safety incidents here in our state. We are a peer agency to the ATSB, who are the National No-Blame Investigator, and OCI, who undertake no-blame investigations in Victoria. We work in collaboration with both the ATSB and OCI on rail safety investigation, with OTSI and OCI undertaking rail safety investigation in New South Wales and Victoria respectively, using the National No-Blame Investigation model. ONSA are the national regulator with powers to enforce rail safety national law. OTSI's investigations are independent of ONSA's investigations. We do not enforce, but we rather enhance rail safety by identifying contributing safety factors and underlying systemic issues. Before I hand over to Marty, I just wanted to say while our Werris Creek investigation was one of the initial catalysts for our research into competency assessment of rail safety workers, this presentation is not just about one operator or one incident. We are seeing examples right across industry. I'm now going to hand you over to Marty Mellis, Senior Transport Safety Investigator, to present on the findings from our Werris Creek investigation. Over to you, Marty.
Righto. Well, thank you very much for that, Kerry. And again, I'd reiterate what Kerry just mentioned there, that this is not one operator, this is not one event. So while this particular investigation focused on an error that was made during a particular activity, which is shunting, these observations are applicable more broadly to all rail safety worker qualifications and competency assessments. This is just one small example of the safety implications which can result from poorly delivered competency assessments, which OTSI is observing across multiple investigations, which, as Kerry said, is why we're sharing these lessons with you today. So to set the scene of Werris Creek, we need to take a step back and look at what happened earlier in the day. So what was occurring on the day was something that we call a banking operation. So a banking operation is where a heavily loaded train needs to ascend a bank somewhere in the journey, but only for a small component of the journey. And as a result, it's not a very good use of motive power from an operational efficiency point of view to have it attached for the entire journey. So instead, as in this case, extra motive power was placed on the train for a short period of time, which is, in this case, at the rear of the train. And the photograph there illustrates those three locomotives at the rear of this grain train. So the specifics of the event were that back in January of 2022, a freight train departed from Narrabri West grain terminal and was bound for Bullock Island in Newcastle. And as I mentioned, there was a steep gradient en route, hence the attachment of three banking locomotives at a place called Werris Creek. Now, there's a fair distance between Werris Creek and the bank itself. From memory, it's about 30-35 minutes travelling time. Now, that means that it actually travels over an undulating grade en route. Now, what that causes, of course, for those who are familiar with operations, is a change in the physics of the train itself, where you have the couplings both compressing and releasing en route. And that is precisely what happened here. So en route from Werris Creek to a place called Ardglen, which was where the bank was, the train came over the top of a hill and stretched out. Now, as the locomotives had not been properly secured to the rear of the train, that caused a separation. And while the brakes applied on the train itself and it came to a stop, the separation event resulted in the brakes not applying on the locomotives, and there's reasons behind that, but I'd encourage you to read the report to find out more, which meant that the brakeless, shall we say, locomotives then ran into the rear of the stationary front portion, causing the collision we see. Now, we could say that a direct cause or a root cause of the event was the non-performance of something called a stretch test. Had that stretch test been performed, it would have been ascertained that the coupling had been unsuccessful and the incident avoided. But as Kerry said, we're a no-blame investigation agency. We don't focus on one point of failure, one error that was made. And in fact, in this investigation, what we actually found was 9 findings. So not just one root cause, there were 9 things going on that day. So there was a lot more going on than someone just making an error. 6 findings, generally speaking, and a further 3 findings that also had the added complexity of being safety issues, which, if you're familiar with OTSI and OTSI reports, we highlight those at the back of the report. And the difference with a safety issue is it is a finding which the organisation directly controls, and we expect that the organisation will take safety action to prevent a recurrence. And I'm happy to say that the organisation that was involved with Werris Creek did so, and all those safety actions were completed by the time the final report was published, which was a great safety outcome. But there's only one finding that I really want to focus on with the presentation today, and that is finding number 6. Finding number 6 was that several rolling stock operators assessed both the mentor driver and trainee driver, so these were the crew on the banking locomotives at the rear, as competent in shunting operations through both VET and enterprise-based or in-house assessments. However, assurance that the skill set demonstrated had met all the RSO's competency requirements was largely ineffective. Now, I will point out that we're not saying that the mentor driver and trainee driver were not competent in shunting. What we were saying was insufficient assurance had been gained to assure the operators that they were competent in those operations. So that is a little bit of something to bear in mind as we move forward. So there were 3 reasons for this. The first being that, welcome to the rail industry, there was an absence of national procedures in shunting. And what that meant was that each operator that these 2 individuals had worked for had differing procedural requirements, including when it came to stretch tests. The second reason that this is problematic was that rolling stock operator procedural guidance for shunting was not always complete, resulting in, necessarily, undeterminable assessment benchmarks. If you don't have a procedure, how on earth do you know what you should be teaching and, more importantly, assessing competence on? And the final one, which is the one we'll spend a fair bit of time on today, is that competency decisions were reached with insufficient evidence collected to support these assessment decisions, whereby skills and observable behaviours were not defined and the underpinning knowledge of the task observed was not assessed. Now, to bring it back to Werris Creek and put that in perspective, we'll put the trainee driver to one side because they were under tuition. But the mentor driver themselves, who were overseeing the work on the day, had been assessed as competent in shunting on no less than 5 occasions over the previous 8-year period, using both VET assessments and in-house enterprise. But on every single one of those 5 occasions, the evidence was limited to a single checkbox on the assessment that the task had been completed successfully. And as we move forward, you'll see that that really is insufficient. Okay. So the first question before we move any further is, what is VET? Well, VET is vocational education and training, the focus being on vocational. These are practical skill sets, which is why VET is quite well suited for the rail industry and in particular operational roles, as opposed to those that are more focused on academia, such as university studies, which certainly have their place. But the important thing to bear in mind as we move forward today is the purpose of VET. That is that it provides nationally recognised portable qualifications, and that's really important. Nationally recognised portable qualifications. There must be confidence that when people come to an operator with a certificate, it has been delivered in a standardised fashion so that you can, with confidence, accept that certificate, which you're required to do with VET. One last point on that is that VET is also a legislative requirement under the Rail Safety National Law for rail safety worker competence. so far as is reasonably practical. And we will talk about some exceptions to that as well. But the good news is you're not on your own. There's a lot to navigate with VET, but there's also some really good guidance material out there. And I'll take the opportunity now to highlight that on this slide pack, we've actually got a lot of underlined phrases, terms, and so forth. And we will be allowing that PowerPoint to be delivered to those that are interested. And they are hot links. So if you're looking for some resourcing, feel free to follow those links in the slide pack when that arrives. ASQA is a great resource, ASQA being the Australian Skills Quality Authority, who are the VET regulator, okay, whereas ONSA obviously is the rail regulator. Now, of note for those that are from a training background, this has recently changed. In fact, on the 1st of July, so we're looking at about 6 weeks ago now, they actually changed these standards, changed the format, split them up. But on the whole, they're fairly similar to what they were earlier in the year and previously. But if anything, they've actually given some better resourcing on things you can do to make sure you're compliant and giving some examples. So I would really strongly encourage anyone who's delivering VET to jump on the ASQA website and have a look. But the one we're going to look at today is the one on the screen on the right there, the National Vocational Education and Training Regulator Outcome Standards Instrument. We'll point out what is quite important here is this is available on the Federal Register of Legislation. And what that means is this is actually a Commonwealth legislative requirement. So what we're going to talk through now is not just good practice. If you are delivering VET assessments, you are required to comply with this. This is the legislative requirement. So the new instrument that we've got on the screen there that's been in for about 6 weeks has 4 parts to it and 23 standards. And it covers all manner of things, including RTO, as in Registered Training Organisation, that is, compliance and outcomes, enforceable trainer and assessor credential policies also exist. But the main thing is that it's designed to support the delivery of nationally consistent and high quality training leading to quality outcomes, which are qualifications. So, we're not going to look at all the standards. As I say, there's 23 of them, but we're going to look at standard 1.4 in particular. And that is that the assessment system ensures assessment is conducted in a way that is fair and appropriate and enables accurate assessment judgment of VET student competency. And again, they give you a fighting chance here. How do you actually impart that and ensure you're doing fair and appropriate assessments? For those that have done a Cert 4 in training and assessment, this should look familiar. The first one is principles of assessment. Things like fairness, flexibility, validity, and reliability is how the assessments are to be conducted. And rules of evidence. So how is the evidence gathered? Validity, sufficiency, authenticity, and currency. The ones that we're going to focus on today when it comes to principles of assessment are validity and reliability. Key takeaways here are that assessments include practical application. Why? Because it's VET. This is a practically based training and assessment program. And reliable, that the evidence is consistently interpreted. This is the assessment evidence, with results of competency comparable irrespective of the assessor, and that's key. With the rules of evidence, the two we'll focus on today are validity, that there is an adequate collection of evidence, and sufficiency, that evidence is of a sufficient quality and quantity to enable that judgment of competence. So again, I'll point out this is within the standards, which means the principles of assessment and rules of evidence aren't just good practice. These are legislative requirements for VET assessment. And I will come to this point a bit later in the presentation, but it's worth introducing the topic here now. And that is, overall, what is the benchmark that an assessor should be reaching when they're collecting evidence? Well, the benchmark is that an assessor, separate from the process, can come to the same conclusion of competence of the candidate solely based on the collected evidence, without even observing the individual undertake the task. So they should be able to pick up an assessment paper and come to exactly the same conclusion solely based on the evidence gathered. But that is not always practical. So one of the downsides of having a nationally recognised portable qualification, if you could call it a downside, is that it must be recognised. So if I, for example, have a certificate 4 in rail network control and I go to another operator, that operator must accept my certificate 4 in rail network control as a qualification. Where that becomes problematic is where you transfer to another organisation in particular, where, for example, the rail network control centre could be very, very different to what that individual has come from. Or they may transfer their location to another control centre. So what that means is, because it's nationally recognised and portable, you cannot actually issue the TLI 40921 again. They already hold the qualification. And this is the uniqueness of VET. Qualifications never expire. What does is the currency of competence, which is where periodic reassessment comes in, because this is part of the safety management system of a rail transport operator. Periodic intervals, rail safety workers must be reassessed. The only way to do that, if you already have the VET qual issued, is to do enterprise attainment. That is in-house training and assessment. Another reason that you might use enterprise attainment instead of VET is, quite frankly, the unit of qualification may not even be available. Another reason that you may not be using the Australian Qualifications Framework, which is VET, is that it's not reasonably practical. Now, I do have to be clear here, reasonably practical has a lot of caveats around it. The first one is that it needs to be unreasonably onerous for the rail transport operator's risk profile. And a classic example of this is heritage and volunteer railways, where you have a heritage outfit which has a couple of carriages completely separate from the main line and may run a tourist train once or twice a month. That is a very different risk profile to Sydney trains, to Metro in Melbourne, to Queensland Rail, to the Rail Commissioner in South Australia. Very, very different risk profile. The other reason it may not be reasonably practical is that the applicable unit of competency itself may be largely irrelevant, or that not all units that make up a qualification are required, so you don't wish to issue the complete certificate. But even in that case, it is still necessary to satisfy as much of the qualification using VET under the Rail Safety National Law, so far as is reasonably practical. So we've had a bit of a talk now about VET and enterprise attainment and why we might use the two. But the critical question is there really a difference in how the two are to be conducted? And we have an answer from ONSA. ONSA have a policy document which, if you take nothing else away from today, if you have not read this policy, I strongly suggest you do. It's very short. There's only about 7 pages to it. It's quite well written, easy to follow, but this is the guide. This is what ONSA's expectations are of rail transport operators when it comes to rail safety worker training and assessment. Now, in amongst those 7 pages, ONSA expects that where you're not using VET and you're using enterprise attainment, that you document your justification for the non-adherence. How have you assessed it's not reasonably practical, especially in consideration of your risk profile? Even if you're not aligning with the AQF, it is preferable that you still align as far as is possible. In relation to assessments, ONSA's expectation is that operators will use Certificate 4 trainer and assessors or equivalents so far as is reasonably practical. And if an AQF qualification didn't exist previously, that it is implemented if a new product comes online. But it's the last expectation that's very important to understand the difference between VET assessment and enterprise assessment. Enterprise assessment is expected to remain consistent with the principles of competence-based training and assessment, ALAR, rules of evidence, principles of assessment. ONSA has effectively given you the answer. You may not be using that, but the expectation is you will use that same process in enterprise attainment. So definitely worth a look. If you haven't read this before, strongly suggest you have a read. And again, that is linked in the slide there, and we'll take you straight to that policy document on ONSA's website. So that's the theory, that's the foundational stuff. Now we get into why we're here today. And that is, what has OTSI actually been seeing when it comes to vet and enterprise assessments? So there's an example on the screen for you, and I'll talk you through where the issues are. The first thing I'll point out is you'll notice there's a watermark, for lack of a better word, or a footnote at the bottom, which mentions that this is restricted information that is being released under the auspices of Section 61 of the federal legislation. And it's worth pointing out that if you've dealt with OTSI or the Office of the Chief Investigator in Victoria or the ATSB previously, you'll know that we provide restricted information protections to any evidence we gather during the course of the investigation. However, in the interest of transport safety particularly, we can judiciously, shall we say, release restricted information in those interests, and which is why we're releasing these today. I will point out these are not from Werris Creek. And you'll also notice that these have been de-identified because it really doesn't matter. This is just an example of what we're seeing. I'll also point out that the top assessment was a vet assessment. So this was an assessment that was used in part to provide someone a certificate for in-train driving. The bottom assessment is an enterprise assessment. So this is one of the on-the-job observations that is done every 18 months to make sure that competence is remaining current as per the safety management system requirements. So on face value, these may not look too bad. My hope is those that have some experience in the vet and training arena will look at these and question just how good these assessments are. So the problems with these include several aspects. And the first is that those principles of assessment, the validity, the reliability, the rules of evidence, the validity and sufficiency just aren't there. Practical skills have not been well described and are not including observable behaviours. So if we look at the bottom one there, 10.1, conduct the following brake tests using the approved procedures. In this case, it's a full brake pipe continuity test. For those familiar with the brake pipe continuity, you'll understand that that usually has about 10 to 15 steps in it. None of those are described there. All we have is that it was performed correctly. But was it? Were some of those 15 steps skipped? Were some of them added? Were some of them done out of sequence? And if they were, did that have a material effect on the outcome? So that is problematic. Where you have a stepped process, it is expected that that will be spelt out. The second issue is that there is no record of the candidate's underpinning knowledge. Why are they actually doing that practical task? Or is it simply a case they are mimicking what they've seen demonstrated to them previously? Well, this is problematic because human nature is such that if we don't understand the purpose of what we're doing, we're unlikely to recall why we need to do it. It's classic in adult learning. So this is an issue. There is no theory assessment here which talks about why I'm doing the task. And if we go back to the brake pipe continuity test, if it failed, why might it have failed? What should I be looking out for? What are some of the issues that I might need to address to fix the problem? The other issue is that there is simply no contextual or supplementary evidence of the observed task. And if we look at the top one there, 2.3, differing classes of rolling stock are known and the differing type of product it is able to convey. Now, helpfully, the contextual evidence is described all classes of rolling stock. I need to be clear here. A paraphrase of the question is not assessment evidence. That is a paraphrase of the question. Now, to put that in further perspective, I won't name the organisation, clearly, but this is a very large rail freight operator who is not stuck with state borders. So what this assessment is asking us to accept is that this particular individual was able to describe correctly every piece of rolling stock that this operator happens to have across Australia, including the products they carry. Probably unlikely. So why is this a problem? Well, the problem here is that insufficient evidence has been gathered to justify that a sound, reliable and consistent competency decision could be made, irrespective of the assessor. All we have is performed correctly and successful. There is nowhere near the level of evidence that another assessor could come up cold, pick up that assessment paper and satisfy themselves that that person is competent on the basis of that evidence. The added issue with this as well is that different assessors, as a result, can have different expectations, we're all human, and requirements during an assessment, which can lead to non-standard assessment outcomes. Were they really sufficiently competent to the level that was required here? Now, my answer to that would be no. If you look at principles of assessment and rules of evidence, these do not cut the mustard. Another example, I won't go into this one in too much detail. I'll just give some highlights on this one. But this is the underpinning knowledge assessment of a route assessment. So train drivers are required to know the route due to the delay in braking and so forth and the inability to pull up on a 5-cent piece. So they need to be able to understand where signals are, speeds and so forth. So there's always a practical component of driving that route. But there's also a theory underpinning knowledge assessment that needs to be used as well. And that's what we're looking at here. Now, I won't go into too many of these, but I will just pick on the third one, which is explain the location of various signals and their designations in the area being assessed. And helpfully, we have some contextual evidence that they identified all signals and designations. Again, a paraphrase of the question, that is certainly not assessment evidence. But concerningly, we're being asked to believe that this person, without error, was able to explain the location of every signal and its designation on that area being assessed. The other thing I'll point out is this is not a yard assessment. This is a route assessment over no less than 70 kilometres of track. 70 kilometres of track, and this person, without failure, managed to describe all that. Unlikely. Now, there is a fair bit in route assessments, and I won't go into too much more. As I say, the slide pack will be provided at a later date, and you're most welcome to go back and have a look. But again, you're not left on your own. RISB have got the management and network route competence. I have, that's actually not a hot link, I'm afraid, because you do need to be a RISB member to access those documents free of charge. So you will need to use your RISB memberships to get that if you so desire. What I will point out is that Australian standards, as with RISB standards, are not mandated. Okay, so they're not mandated, but they are very good practice. And in fact, they would fall under the provisions of what was reasonably practical to be known or ought to be reasonably known about controlling a risk, which is straight out of the Rail Safety National Law. If you are doing route assessments, there is a lot in them, a lot of requirements, but remember that top bullet point there. They are informed by route risk assessments. As with everything in rail, it's risk-based, okay? Other guidelines within the document include ways of doing gap analysis, route learning plans and so forth, and some of the 32 route elements that you may wish to assess. As I say, that will be available to you at a later date if you wish. But I hope the point is being made that that just does not pass as far as a theory assessment goes. Now, unfortunately, it's not limited to these two assessments. There's a lot more going out in industry, and we'd like to highlight those for you now. So these are other emerging issues that we're seeing in our current investigations. And one actually figured in finding 6, if you remember, and that is that a lack of procedural guidance which describes the task is not available. How can you put an assessment benchmark or a training benchmark if you don't actually know what the individual is supposed to be doing? The problem with no benchmark means you are going to get inconsistent competency judgments based solely on an individual assessor's knowledge, skills, and experience. That is not a good idea. The next issue is non-assessment of workers on transference to a new rail transport operator or location in relation to its specific policies, procedures, instructions, operating environment, and equipment. I'm not joking here. This is happening out there where people are turning up with a certificate for, and that is just being accepted with an entirely different employer. Due to a lack of time or resources, components of assessments are being skipped entirely. Now, what that means is we're seeing assessments where lines are being drawn through assessment components because they weren't assessed. And a classic example of this is your block mineral trains, where they go from depot to port, to mine, to port, to mine, to port. No shunting, no provisioning, no brake tests. Now, the assessors think they're doing the right thing. They're putting a strike through. I can't assess what I can't see, but are then putting a competent on the entire assessment as a whole. Well, no, that's not correct. There were aspects that were never assessed. And the last one, when we've done this presentation individually for some of the operators in New South Wales, has caused a little bit of consternation. And that is that verbal description of a task is sufficing as evidence of practical skill. And I'll draw your attention back to the principles of assessment validity, which talks about the practical application of knowledge as part of the assessment process. Long story short, if it is important enough to be on a practical assessment, it is important enough to assess practically. So sometimes it helps to give you an example. So I was a train driver before I joined OTSI, and was a driver for about 17 years. In my first 6 months as a train driver back in the early 2000 itself, I was actually faced with 3.16. There had been a shunting accident that day. I was not involved, I might add. But we were required to fix the mess, shall we say, by detaching the defective wagon at the rear of the train and remarshalling the consist. So that happened in my first 6 months as a train driver in 2000. Now, we did the task. I think it was about 10 o'clock at night. We completed it safely. We completed it as per the rulebook requirements. And I think today, as I stand here, 25 years later, I think I could confidently explain to you how we did that, what process we followed, what we did. My question to you is, would you today accept me explaining to you step by step something I did once 25 years ago as current evidence of my practical competence in that task? Because that is what 3.16 is asking you to believe. Bit of food for thought. So the other aspect of that is remembering that some of these tasks can be in less ideal situations. As I say, I can explain this to you now in an office, an IC conditioned office, daylight hours. But what about at night? What about at 3 a.m.? What about in the pouring rain? These are all things to bear in mind. Okay, so we've talked a lot about foundational knowledge. We've talked a lot about vet enterprise, how it compares. Are they different? No, they're not. But why are we bringing this to your attention? Well, it's because we are worried. There is a widespread and varied nature of issues in the rail industry that we are seeing in New South Wales in particular at the moment, because that's where we're based, where competency assurance of rail safety workers is potentially resulting in gaps of safety critical knowledge and skill, which it should come as no surprise is a focus area for our investigations. But I should also point out we're not the only ones that have noticed this. The ATSB has also noticed Interstate of New South Wales issues with rail safety worker competence. OTSI too have noted issues with rail safety worker competence. These are not issues limited to state borders. This is not a New South Wales problem. This is industry-wide. If we go back to finding 6, it was several rolling stock operators over that 8-year period had not done the appropriate competence assurance activities on the mentor driver. This is not one operator. This is widespread. So just before I hand back to Kerry, OTSI is a strange beast. As Kerry mentioned, we're a no-blame investigator, which is a little bit unusual. But not only are we a no-blame investigator, we're actually one of the rare areas, shall we say, that tries to put itself out of business. My colleagues and I come to work each day hoping to prevent the next accident, effectively putting ourselves out of work. If there's no more accidents, there's no more job for us. And to be frank, we would be very happy about that at OTSI. That is our end game, not to have a job. But regrettably, we have to be realistic. In the meantime, there are going to be, unfortunately, more accidents. We do not know when. We do not know where. We do not know why. And we do not know how yet. But my question to you is, will the next accident we attend be one of your services? And if it is, will training and assessment be found to be a contributing factor? Okay, well, you've probably heard enough of me talking now, so I will hand back to Kerry for wrap up and then Q&A session at the end.
Great, thanks very much, Marty. So look, before we close, I just wanted to reiterate some of the key takeaways from today's presentation. So we've got enterprise and vet competency assessment requirements are effectively identical. They should both follow the principles of competence-based training and assessment. A good assessment is one that allows an independent assessor to come to the same conclusion of candidate competence as yourself based solely on your assessment material and the evidence collected. The issues we have identified today are not unique. Industry custom and practice appears to have unintentionally drifted from the principles, resulting in not only inconsistent competency assessment, but inconsistent competency outcomes, which may lead to safety incidents. So please review and validate your current assessments. Are they following the principles of assessment and the rules of evidence? And lastly, there's some really helpful guidance material available from ASQA, ONSA and RISB as well. So you can jump onto their websites and get that information. And finally, to close, you'll find our investigation reports, including the Werris Creek report, on OTSI's website, along with our safety advisory notice on assessment of rail safety worker competence, which also has some useful information. You can also keep in touch with OTSI by subscribing to our regular newsletter and by following us on LinkedIn. So thank you for your time today. I hope you found the presentation both interesting and informative. I'm going to hand back now to Sudha for some questions.
Thanks, Kerry. Fantastic, Marty. Great presentation and really lots of insights into one of the key challenging questions that we ask ourselves, but also fairly challenging from a practical perspective as well. So a couple of questions put through to start the conversation. There are a couple of questions coming through as well. Given the intent of AQF to support skills portability, how do you balance recognizing existing qualification and ensuring the local operational competence? You know, where's the balance? Because there's always this pressure to make sure there is portability and there's no delay and there is the transfer of skills going from one location to another. And there are obviously risks, but where's the balance? How do we deal with that?
Take that one if you like, Marty. I think Marty made the point before. It's a risk-based assessment. You find your balance by treating your risks. You consider the risk to your operation compared with the qualification that someone brings across. You have to obviously assess where that qualification has come from, what the gaps might be in your own operation, and you use a risk-based approach.
Yeah, exactly. Something that I should have mentioned in the presentation, that's okay because the recording's still going. It's important to know that these are not OTSI requirements, and I should have actually said that earlier in the presentation. What OTSI did was, and during the investigation process, this is how we operate, we look at what guidance material is out there, and then was the operator following that guidance material? So these are not OTSI's perspectives here. This is what is required of industry. As a result, well, I've got to be careful what we say because we can't be prescriptive because that's not OTSI's role. But I would suggest that what we have seen other operators do, which is always nice, what do some operators do? And that is you go right back to basics, which is where you have a position description, you do a job task analysis, you do a job safety analysis, you have training needs analysis matrices, and effectively you tick it off. I mean, that would be one method that people use, where they will look at what is the qualification that is brought to us, how does that compare to our own localised operations? But I will make the point again, in this case, if someone turns up with VET, yes, you are required to accept that qualification at face value, but that is where enterprise attainment comes in to fill in those gaps.
Let me quickly call a couple of the questions here. Is there an opportunity for recertification principles for safety critical role implementing mandatory framework in place through the VET process that would use media for assurance? CSCA are using it in a program called CrewSafe as an industry-approved VOC. I'm not sure exactly the meats around it, but is there an opportunity for research principle for safety critical role implementing mandatory framework in place to the VET process that would use media for assurance?
Oh, okay. I'll just open up the Q&A there just so I can have a quick read. Okay. Okay. If I understand that question correctly, I think it's to do with, I'm picking up on the use of media for assurance. So I'm thinking that there's a question around, can you use video evidence as part of the VET process? I think that's what that question is asking. If that be the case, yeah, certainly we've seen some operators are using video evidence, photographic evidence of people completing a task. That's certainly out there. Yeah, the VET process itself is really not suited for recertification. I don't want to provide advice on this because we're not VET experts. I mean, this is just one of many areas that we're investigating. So I would suggest that you have a look at what ASQA have. But my understanding is you cannot issue the same certificate number again. But if the code changes, you can. But I would take that with caution. I would definitely check with ASQA to make sure that you can do that. But that's my understanding.
And again, it comes back to a similar sort of question again, Marty and Kerry, about online training and a lot of video-based training that is taking place. The value of that in the reassessment process versus is it just a quick fix for something, or does it I'm not sure whether you have found something from the investigations perspective and your research. What are some of those pros and cons, and how do you balance that in this whole area of competency assessment or reassessment for that case?
I'm seeing a big smile on Marty's face, so I'm going to hand that answer over to him because I think he might have something to say about that.
Yeah, look, that's a great question, and thank you for posing that question. I'm going to go right back to the principles of assessment validity. If you're using VET, you are required to assess practically. That's the end of the story. While you may use certain methods of training, for example, maybe PowerPoint slides and online, that's fine. But if it's a practically based skill set, it must be assessed practically. There's no wriggle room there. It's, it is very clear. So the method of delivery, I mean, can be open to interpretation, but it is that practical assessment of practical tasks is necessary. And when we go to the ONSA policy, and once again, that policy is a good read, ONSA have made it pretty clear too that even with that in-house enterprise assessment, you are required to follow those same sorts of principles with rail safety worker training and assessment. And I think the important thing here is to think about why we're doing this. And we're doing it because we want people to be competent. If we have people that are not competent doing a task, that is going to lead to disaster, quite frankly. This is what happens. So it's always a case of, yes, there's a balancing act, sure, but don't forget the philosophy behind why you're doing training. There's a reason for it. It is a risk control. You have found this in your business as being a method of risk control, effective training and assessment.
I think if I could add to that, Marty, too, I think what we are seeing is a lot more desktop training, what I would refer to as desktop training anyway, and that is resulting in competency gaps from our observations. They're not getting the practical, they're not able to apply what they've learned at a desktop into practice. So I think that is something to consider, is how you measure that and how you assure yourselves that the person that you are issuing that competency to is competent, essentially.
Another question around the investigation and your research in itself. Were there any sort of data modeling done with regards to, areas where needs attention was highlighted? Going back to look at how many times they have failed before they succeeded kind of question to demonstrate competency. Did you guys do any of those sort of assessment as part of your research and investigation into the competency issue?
Short answer, no. No, we did not. And the reason being that there has to be a limit to what we investigate, or we'd never get the reports finished. But I'm just reading the question. It's an excellent point to make. If we look at concept being a health assessment framework should identify percentage of failed assessments or part assessments, and we know that people are not perfect, so collective analysis should reflect this. Look, I think as an organisation, I think that would be an excellent way of going about things, of having a look at these assessments and seeing if people are falling down in a particular area, because this could be an indicator that the training needs, propping up, shall we say. The other point I'll make too is to say we can't go into too much detail because we're an investigative agency and it's not really our place. But you're absolutely right. People are not perfect, and yet we're seeing 100% correct on assessment pieces, which is not that's not right. You would not expect people to be 100% correct 100% of the time, and there seems to be a fear of showing where people are falling down on assessments as well, which is very important to capture, because you capture that, you upskill the person and you reassess them, and now they're competent. So yeah, I think there's a bit in that. I mean, it would be great if organisations were doing that, but don't be afraid to mark down when people aren't hitting the mark either. This is absolutely critical to competence-based training and assessment.
Another question very much linked to this is around the technology as a solution for that. Recently there are some AI tools being used on trains to remember the previous past signals and what state it was. So even if the driver doesn't remember them, he can actually see it because some AI technology has picked it up and recorded it. And so there is this more technology coming into play where it can be prompters to remind you of the things that needs to be done. What's their view on those kind of technologies being used as support for the competency of individuals and less reliance on the human being per se to remember those things here?
I might take that one, Marty. I think there's a risk that if you introduce technology to replace a competency, you're potentially opening yourself up to a risk. If you are using technology to try and catch the fundamental human errors that occur, that's a different thing. I think, what Marty said before is no one actually passes 100% on an assessment. People are prone to error, and that is just the human condition. And if you're using technology to help you prevent those human condition from resulting in an incident, then I think that's a really good addition. If you are using that technology to replace a competency and you're relying on that technology, I think you'd really need to think about the risk associated with that. And I think you'd be wanting to do a pretty solid risk assessment.
Brilliant. I think I'm just going to quickly close off the last question. I think one of the things I'll read from your presentation is that there has been a bit of a drift in the assessment requirements of how reassessments are working. And I guess that also can quite easily become cultural practice as well after a period of time. So what can you do to reverse that? What are some of the simple steps that people can do? I mean, that's a compliance focused way of addressing that, but this is culture. What can we do to kind of reverse that and bring back that competency assurance?
I think things like today, Suda, I think these are the opportunities to really reset and bring people's attention back to where the foundation principles lie. Yes, we've just noticed, and it's not just the rail industry, because OTSI do buses and ferries as well in terms of our investigations. And we're noticing a drift right through. There is that drift away from the basic principles. And even when you talk to training professionals at time, they go, oh, what's wrong with what we're doing? And you actually got to bring them right back to basics and say, here's some basic principles. Do you think that follows those basic principles? And we often get the, oh, okay, no, it doesn't. So I think really just education is one of the key things.
I think
I might just add to that as well. I mean,
sorry, go ahead, Martin.
It's also a case of validating those assessments. Go back to basics. ASQA make it pretty clear what they expect when it comes to validation of assessments. And again, ONS's expectation is you will effectively follow much the same process with enterprise attainment. So, if you're seeing, I suppose, the lesson here, if you want a takeaway, if your assessments currently look like what we were showing on the screen, you may have a problem, and you may wish to look at that.
And probably final question. I know we talked about the risk-based approach to looking at the requirement for reassessment, and you also have the balance of making it standardized across the board, because risk-based could vary from organization to organization as well. What's the pros and cons of having something standardized across the board every 6 months, every 12 months, or based on a role-based scenario for reassessment? What's the pros and cons of value on that?
Sorry, I can't actually see the question.
Is that across just a closing comment from just a closing question from myself around the fact that closing question from myself around the fact that there is standardization is a big question across the board, and it's easy to standardize something, to say, well, let's do this everyone does the same thing. Let's say, let's do reassessment every 6 months or 12 months or 2 years or whatever it is, versus risk-based, which has a variability across organization to organization. What are the pros and cons of it from your perspective, the value in standardizing versus allowing it to variable within risk-based environments?
I mean, harmonisation is one of the big challenges across the industry at the moment. I think to have a qualification fully transportable, you really need everyone doing the same thing. So it will always have to be a risk-based approach until people start doing the same thing. But I think ONSA would obviously have a view on this as well. I think they would probably stepping well over my remit now, but I think probably they would say take a risk-based approach. You really have to go back, because your operations, even though technically you might do something the same as someone else, the risk profile for a freight operator is completely different to a passenger operator, for example. So those are the sort of things you really need to factor in and take into account.
No, brilliant. Final comments from you, Marty. Anything else to add before we close off?
Yeah, I suppose the only thing I'd add is I've always found it a bit peculiar in the rail industry how everyone works in such a silo. It's almost as if everyone is constantly reinventing the wheel for this organisation as opposed to that. And I mean, just a comment would be I'd love to see the rail operators work together more. If you're doing a route assessment, a classic that I can think of is a route assessment, where you have train drivers operating over the same route from 4 or 5 different companies. why wouldn't the 4 or 5 of you get together and go, let's make a benchmark assessment for that route? Kerry raises an excellent point. Where you have procedural differences, that's going to be problematic. But there's actually probably more similarities between operators than you think. So just maybe something that the rail industry could think about.
Very, very insightful, Kerry and Marty. I'm sure everyone who participated today has just really got something really to think about from the learnings from the Werris Creek incident itself, but also broadly around the feedback from investigation and where some areas of improvements can be made from a competency perspective and the assessment perspective. So really, thank you so much for being part of this Rail Safety Week webinar. It's been hugely value add, and I'm sure everyone has really enjoyed the conversation and the presentation. So very well done. Thank you so much. And thanks everyone for participating and your questions. And I'm sure it'll be value adding, and stay safe during Rail Safety Week and continue to keep that as a focus. And let's keep our railways safe as we continue. Thanks everyone. Much appreciated. Cheers.
Thank you. Bye.